I want to talk a little bit about the HQP part, which is a third column here, 30%, one-third of your score. Use every opportunity you have to describe your HQP training environment. There's a free flow text box in the main application. Don't only just list all the students you supervise and postdocs. Describe what they've done, how your group works. In particular, describe the successes, prizes, awards, career path, things like that. We want to see what kind of environment there is, and it is the training component is very important for this particular mission. It's very strongly emphasized by NCLEX. So do not underestimate that part. It's 1/3 of your value eventually of the score, and so do as best as you can to highlight, even on an anecdotal level, all the exciting things that your students have done. So I guess that's it for me for now.
All right, great, thank you. So I can either open it up to the floor, or I can ask some questions myself. Why don't I just get started with a question? For the early stage career researchers, I know NSERC says it's judged equally, but there are some special considerations for the funding bid. But are there any sort of common problems with applications from early career researchers that you notice or that can be overcome? And what are your thoughts about the process for that stage of applicant?
If I may begin, so what I noticed regarding early career researchers is that when it comes to the excellence of the researcher, typically the rating is moderate, but that is well accepted, so that for an early career researcher might not be fatal when it comes to funding, but typically the excellence of researcher is qualified as moderate because we cannot really differentiate between an early career researcher and somebody who might be, let's say, close to a Nobel Prize. So that would be exceptional, and then the early career researcher by comparison is a moderate. Very important, the merit of the proposal, because if you look at these factors, HQP training again cannot be excellent or outstanding. Typically, I'm saying, of course, there could be exceptions. So for the early career researcher, really, the captivating proposal, the merit of the proposal, that's where everything is hinges on ultimately. And as my colleagues said, indeed, this fine line between general and technical, and between an exciting research and discovery-based research, and really to show the promise, to show what that early career researcher can bring to the community. That's very important.
Even if you're early career researcher, you've had some experience training students, let's say as a postdoc, does that count? Does that go towards, does it speak towards that criteria?
So in our panel, it generally doesn't. So there's not a lot of value in expending a lot of energy talking about the undergrads that you trained as a postdoc or a PhD student. Your plan is what's going to get you. In our panel, typically ECRs are moderate on HQP, and that moderate is based on the plan. It's really exceptional to go above moderate for a first-time applicant. For us, for first-time applicants on the researcher, the excellence of the researcher, typically strong or above, and they wouldn't get funded if they were moderate there and moderate in HQP. So strong, very strong are entirely possible for first-time applicants. I think that HQP, so I'm jumping beyond your question, for the place where HQP ends up being the make or break criterion is for that first renewal. Because if you stay at moderate at your first renewal and you don't counterbalance that with at least a very strong summer, you're toast. And we've seen that frequently. And so that's, I think, where your where you have to change strategies in terms of addressing the HQP criterion, and you have to make the most of the trainees your case for your training record. It won't do to have the same record that you had as an ECO.
I guess I can quickly confirm that physics works exactly the same way as botany. So sort of kind of the default rating for assistant professor just starting out who has not yet had an independent training record elsewhere is usually moderate. However, NSERC does apply sort of a correction factor to that, so you are not being penalized for the lack of a training record. That's important to realize. Okay, so even though the formal rating is moderate and you get a note on the response, there is an internal correction factor taken into account that you are an ECR and not an established researcher. Okay, and yeah, I mean, if you had prior training, okay, if you had supervised some postdocs, you might as well mention it. But unless it was really in a completely independent capacity, I mean, we can't do that much with it either. The CV, on the other hand, of course, I mean, well, we look at them across the board. We compare the potential Nobel Prize winners to the young assistant professor, and the scale has to be national across it. So then it's essentially very, very difficult for somebody early in the career, of course, to go into the high categories. But again, strong is perfectly common. So perhaps even very strong, depending on the concept.
Any other question?
Is that correction factor for early career investigators applied across the board? All of them use?
Yes. We have it in our committee as well. That's why I said that it's not fatal, even a moderate rating for the excellence of research, because it's not as good.
So, well, that's a question I don't need to talk before.
Was it a regression you said, so it depends on the years of experience, or is it just categorical, early, mid, the correction factors?
No, there's only two categories. So there's early career research and established research. That's it. And well, the ECR only once.
Yeah.
I received this question from a faculty member, and it's on the other end of the career scale. If you are, I don't know at this point, senior stage of career, even soon to be retiring or emeritus, what are obviously there are challenges there as well, but when your experience when reviewing those applications, what are the common problems? What are the ways to get around these things? I mean, there are realities in your career at that stage, so I'm curious about that.
This may have been my question.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Because it seems unrealistic to be proposing a long-term, which is 10 or more year program, if you have a 5 or less year horizon, which is your last increment. What has traditionally happened there? Because there will always people in the last increment. And this comes back to we've run programs. So you're requesting funding for a program that's well established and might well be on track and has its last whatever it is number of years to go. But you can't be promising the moon as younger people can because it's not credible.
Well, ironically, I sort of fit into that category myself.
We all will.
3 years ago, before I came on as group chair, I was in that category. Quite honestly, I applied for only a 3-year discovery grant. I've been in the system long enough, and I said, oh, here's what I want to do in the next 3 years, and then years 4 and 5, I just left blank. Now, there's provision to do a shorter discovery grant application, but it's rarely allowed. With the exceptional circumstance, you're in a terminal year or something, you want to just wrap something up and you've got a couple of students to finish off and it goes. Or there may be an illness and you want, and that's so forth. Interestingly enough, when I made my case, I thought I just had a phase out UBC and they turned me down. And they gave me a 5-year grant at a reduced rate, but the total was almost the same. And I questioned that. I actually challenged that. I went back and I actually appealed it. And they said, well, we see that you're not going to finish what you think you're going to finish in 3 years. Which I thought, do they know something I don't know? But anyway, that's beside the point. And they gave me the 5-year grant. So I accepted that. And then, of course, next year I got invited to be a chair thing. So I don't know if there's any connection there. But that becomes a real issue. And we have in our committee, we have a lot of senior people in the country who are applying, and many of them, quite frankly, don't get renewed. They simply do not get renewed. They haven't made their story, they haven't made their case, and it really has to do with living too much in the past and relying on old reputation and so forth, and they haven't done much publishing, they have done very little training in the field with HQP, and they're trying to kind of keep going, for a couple of, and quite frankly, it's very transparent. I hear that across the COGS a lot, it's just so transparent. But you can't stop them, and you can't discriminate on the basis of age in terms of the application. So if you're 82 and you're still active, you can put your application in, chances are you might get some money. The more difficult cases come in our community, at least, when you have the adjunct professors who are coming in from outside. You're allowed to apply as an adjunct professor, but there aren't very many of them, at least not in our EG 1509. They have to be exceptional and carrying an appointment someplace, and they're actively involved in graduate student training, not writing a book and excuses, that type of thing. But yeah, you have to be practical and say, look, I have a 2 to 3 or 4 year plan I'd like to finish off, and make it, don't, I mean, and the other thing that comes up, and I've heard this from all the 4 sub-chairs that I work with, is that people are asking for ridiculous amounts of money, knowing full well that they're never going to spend it in terms of training the students, because especially if they put PhDs down, it's going to take 4 or 5 years to train a doctoral student, and they're not going to even be there for more than 2 to 3 years.
So if I could just ask if there's anyone who disagrees with that, because a colleague who is on the evaluation committee has said that it is foolish to ask for less than 5 years or less than the maximum amount of money you could imagine getting if you weren't time limited. And that seems it certainly seems wrong to me. But I'm not willing to be right if it means zero funding.
So I would suggest applying for 4 or 5 years and applying for the amount of money you need to do the work that you plan to do. I would say that for me, looking at the grid, I would say it once that this is your last application, and then move on. So that would justify a long-term plan that is not a 15, 20-year horizon. I would say still make sure that you're adhering to the criteria. What I've seen be unsuccessful is here are all the loose ends that have accumulated over the last 30 years. I want to tie each one of them up. That's not a program. That's a set of projects. And that is not easy to fit into the criteria. So still make sure that there's a program, that the long-term goal fits the time horizon, and that any provision for, tie up the loose ends. So if there are students that you project are going to go beyond that, have co-supervision laid out, have sort of those kinds of contingencies that we would expect in any case. So essentially wrap it together. I don't agree with the suggestion that you have to apply for the most you could ever imagine getting. The budget is probably the place where the budget needs to be sensible, but other than that, it's kind of irrelevant. It's the criteria that are going to get you the score, and that's what's going to determine the amount. So I wouldn't overly stress about the budget.
I also support the 5-year application based on the experience in my committee.
It's easier.
Yeah.
And just make the case for the program you have. Okay, there can be a long-term vision that goes beyond the 5 years, but whatever you want to accomplish in there, put it out for the best possible way. The only other thing I quickly want to say is talk about the new stuff and not 4 pages on, okay, all the wonderful things that happened in the past, if you permit me to say that. One wants to see the new propositions, the new proposals, and the projects and how the students can benefit from that. Of course, the first page of the proposal has to sort of give the history and set the background and things like that. But then there has to be sort of, okay, these are the new things that I want to do, and that will advance the whole